So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's lecture and debate about the anti-gender movements in the EU and in the Czech Republic. My name is Zora Hesová. I'll briefly introduce this moment, this venue, our guests, and then in a few minutes we'll start, which will leave a few more minutes for some late arrivals. So we would like to start today a project at the Institute for Political Science at the Faculty of Arts that will look into the way the talk about human rights is shifting under the influence of culture wars. So I would just like to introduce very briefly this project, and then the topic of today's talk, and then we'll pass to our guests, who will actually introduce one of the major issues of our project. So give me a few minutes just to briefly present OLIPOL, which is a project that is supported by the faculty and the Norway funds, and is led by a research team around Professor Pavel Barsha at our institute, and who the research team thinks further, starting from a project that we had in last years, where we worked on culture wars and the relation of Czechs and Slovaks towards their minorities or their others. And we realized, and that this is as a guise of introduction to our main topic today, we realized that in the last 10 years of cultural conflicts about migration, Islam, gender, we realized that a lot of norms and values that were taken for granted or accepted have been repoliticized, opened, and that is also the way we frame rights and dignities of certain people or groups of people have been changing. We want to address that. We want to address it by looking at ways in which so-called spooks or strange entities like gender ideology, about which we'll be speaking today, or migration, or Islam, or liberalism, have been filled with new meanings, and we will look into ways in these new meanings have helped to build large populist constituencies, and also create panic and projects fears, and in which certain negative tendencies like Islamophobia, homophobia, or misogyny have been kind of mainstreamed or have become accepted, and in which, and this will be the topic of today's talk, also in which certain hierarchy of rights have been establishing itself between the nationals and the foreigners, also men and women, or certain majorities and minorities. And this open denial of rights and dignity is the topic of our project, which we will try to describe, decipher, and analyze, and then with a civil rights organization based in Brno, we'll try to address it by developing methodologies and also communication to chosen publics, especially to those people who actually work in social contexts in which they could help countering these effects. So this is our team, people from the Institute for Political Science, and also people from Nesehnutí in Brno, and our library has started to be filling with interesting texts. We will also post texts of our two speakers. So if you are interested in learning more from Neil Datta and Eva Svatoňová, please refer to our library on the website of our institute. And now I'd like to start today's debate. One of the topics is gender, besides migration, Islam, and relation to other ethnic minorities. And when talking about gender, or the gender ideology in quotes, everybody has come across certain texts that were written by Neil Datta, our main speaker today, who is a researcher at the European Parliamentary Forum for Sexual and Reproductive Rights in Brussels, and who actually a few years ago has opened the issue, the topic, the investigation into transnational networks that were organizing policy and lobbying projects on the level of the EU, in EU institutions, and whose investigation into this reality has actually spurred a lot of other research into anti-gender mobilization, and one of them is our colleague Eva Svatoňová, who is just finishing her PhD at Aarhus in Denmark on anti-gender movements in the Czech Republic. So today we would like to learn more about the background of this phenomenon from Neil Datta first, and then from Eva Svatoňová, who will both speak for about half an hour, and then you will have the opportunity to ask questions. So please, Neil, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Zora. And I've prepared a PowerPoint also. Let's see. Yeah, so while the PowerPoint is loading, just a little bit of background about myself. So I'm Neil Datta. I'm the secretary of an organization called EPF, the European Parliamentary Forum for Sexual and Reproductive Rights. EPF is an independent organization, so we're not linked with any of the institutions, any of the European institutions. We're independent, and our members are working groups of parliamentarians across Europe working to improve laws, policies, funding on sexual reproductive rights. So that's contraception, abortion, maternal health, etc. And we were sort of brought into looking into anti-gender movements and campaigns, not by a deliberate choice that we made, but more because we started seeing these things happening across different European countries. And from our perspective in Europe, in Brussels, where we're not rooted in any one country, we started seeing similar patterns happening across different countries. We saw the same names of individuals and organizations appearing in Latvia or Portugal or France. And then from that, we started seeing that something was happening. And so I think perhaps that's why we were one of the early ones to notice that something was happening. And we started writing about this, analyzing it, trying to understand it. And so, as Zora mentioned, we've written a few reports about this. And I'll present a PowerPoint which sort of encapsulates sort of our thinking on this. So, okay. Right. So I need to I'll stand up because I need to see the PowerPoint as I'm speaking about it. Okay. Voila. So here's just a few examples of contestation on a broad range of different sexual and reproductive health or social issues. So there we see from Poland, the well-known contestation on abortion. Then we see from Armenia contestation around the Istanbul Convention, which addresses violence against women. And there we have from France the very well-coordinated homophobic marches of 2013 against equal marriage. And so here, just to show, it's a number of what appears to be unrelated issues: abortion, violence against women, LGBT rights, and happening all across the continent, from well-known conservative Catholic Poland to secular France, all the way over to Eastern Europe in Armenia. So if we take a look at these examples, we see that they take place within the wider context of what's called anti-gender activism. And so we can see that there's been examples of contestation against the Istanbul Convention in a whole range of different countries. Bulgaria completely failed in ratifying the Istanbul Convention back a few years ago when it was holding the EU presidency. Croatia managed to do this, but despite severe opposition. And there's been appearances of contestation in a number of different countries. Then we take a look at abortion and attempts to restrict abortion. There were the 2016 draft law in Poland aiming to virtually ban abortion. The draft law was withdrawn, but it came back in 2020 through a judgment from the Constitutional Tribunal, so-called a very contested Constitutional Tribunal. And we've seen examples to restrict abortion rights at the level of the European Union, Council of Europe, and even in progressive Sweden, there's been more than 10 attempts to try to restrict abortion laws. And then we have traditional marriage. We have the well-known attempts to put into the country's constitution the definition of marriage between a man and a woman, so a very traditional heteronormative definition of marriage. And we see this appearing through citizens' initiative in a range of different countries. And I understand here in Czechia, there's also a similar initiative underway. So we see all of these things happening. And for many people, it looked like it came from the bottom up, that it was a reflection of countries getting more conservative. But as I'll point out, that's not entirely the full truth. So who's behind all of these different contestations? Because when you scratch beneath the surface, behind the anti-LGBT, the anti-abortion, and behind the anti-Istanbul Convention, you find that it's usually the same organizations. So who are they? First, what we can see is that we have in Europe, over the past 10 years, a new social movement that has emerged. And one movement which defines itself as being against gender ideology. Now, gender ideology is not a real ideology. I think we need to emphasize this. It's an invention of Catholic thinkers to describe what they perceived that they had lost at some major moments in the mid-1990s when the concepts of sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights entered into the UN vocabulary. These were the conferences on population and development in Cairo in 1994 and Beijing on women's rights in 1995. These were big losses for social conservatives led by the Vatican. These were big gains for human rights defenders, including, I hope, most of us, or if not all of us in this room today. So they perceived of this loss as being because of gender ideology. So it's a way of describing what was lost, and it's a way of also putting a label onto the opponents, so that those responsible for these human rights advances, they were the radical feminists, the gays, the Freemasons, the secularists, etc. All of them coordinated by Soros and now Bill Gates. Okay, so this is who's behind gender ideology. It's not a real thing. It's a way to describe things that are displeasing in society. And then what we see has emerged in Europe is a new set of actors, so legal entities. Many of them are NGOs, think tanks, political parties, social media platforms. In a number of countries, what happened was that there were the old anti-abortion organizations, which had been around for a long time. They had never been that important, or they were able to pose a nuisance phenomenon, but they were never very big. Now we see that by taking on anti-gender or gender ideology as their main opponent, they can have a rebranding. They have a new lease on life. They have new things to do and to be against. And I'll go into what they're against. And some key features of this new movement, which is, as I mentioned, based on the carcass of the anti-abortion movement. 3 features are professionalization, transnational networking, and the capacity to generate new leadership, or that of generational renewal. And now, in terms of targets, the first set of targets was really sexual reproductive health and rights. So abortion, and then related to this, contraception, assisted procreation, etc. From there, then very quickly came contestation of LGBT rights. In a number of countries, this was equal marriage, but then also in some other countries, they can go further and even go against non-discrimination against LGBT people. Then gender, and here gender, we should understand this as a very fluid concept. They don't care that it has a very specific definition or not, but simply the word gender, they can cause what I would say, it can provoke what I would call an allergic reaction by the anti-gender movement. So you just need to put the word gender in there, and then you can have a whole range of contestation around that. So this targets gender studies, gender mainstreaming, the Istanbul Convention, etc. Children's rights is another area, one that we often tend to overlook, and specifically that question of who gets to have the final say of the best interests of the child. Is it the family, and by family the traditional heterosexual patriarchal family with a father at the top, or is it the state? Can the state intervene on behalf of the best interests of the child? And you can see this manifesting itself in comprehensive sexuality education, but also increasingly into custody cases or custodial rights. And then religious freedom. religious freedom specifically from the perspective of my freedom as a Christian is a higher order of human right than your freedoms as an LGBT or something else. So elevating religious freedom to a higher level of legal protection. And what we've seen is that they've basically taken old religious ideas, because just about all of these groups are religious in inspiration. They camouflage it to a greater or lesser extent, to the extent that it's required in whatever context they're operating in. And what they've done is that they've taken the language that they use, which are old religious ideas, and then processed it so that it appears like human rights sounding language. And like this, you can use this language in the UN, in the EU, in courts, etc. So here's just a more detailed look at some of these three key aspects that I mentioned, that of professionalization, transnational networking, and generational renewal. So in terms of professionalization, so that's what I mentioned, the secularization of religious ideas to fit within a human rights legal discourse. So there, instead of talking about protecting life of the unborn, that won't work now, but we can talk about human dignity. Okay, that's a more fluid concept, but behind human dignity is a threefold life, family, and freedom aspect around which they can articulate their thinking, their legal thinking. Another key aspect of professionalization is that they're using the same legal tools as normal progressive human rights advocates. So for a long time, human rights was simply like a private hunting ground for progressives. You could simply make your case for your little aspect of human rights, and then you did not meet an opposition. You may have met with indifference, but you could slowly make your case and then work towards an incremental change for the better. Now we're finding that there's a whole community or movement out there which is actively working against the human rights architecture, using the same tools as human rights advocates. And this is a new feature for Europe as of the past 5 to 10 years, so that they are as skilled in taking cases before courts, before parliaments, etc., as the best human rights lawyers, etc. And then what we've seen also in terms of professionalization is that they have learned how to occupy new discursive niches, so that going against abortion does not work in some cases, or going against LGBT rights, but you can talk about different things. Demography, where populations are declining, well, then should we be promoting birth rather than promoting abortion? Ecology, going on with the green sentiment present in many feelings. In many countries, or decolonialization. Why are you accepting here in Czechia these things being imposed upon you from Brussels or from the EU? Another aspect is transnationalization. This community is as capable as any other of renting, a meeting room in a Novotel or an Ibis hotel, a 3-star hotel somewhere, and organizing a meeting just like any social movement can. And they do this. One of these transnational platforms is Agenda Europe, which I've written about. And they have a number of different international platforms. Agenda Europe is where they really strategize and brainstorm about advocacy and policy initiatives. But then you have the big global jamboree, the big global meeting, which is the World Congress of Families, where you have all the dignitaries and everyone sort of coming together there. And then a more recent one is the Political Network of Values, which brings together the politicians from North America, Latin America, and Europe. Right now it's being headed really by the Hungarians. And then in terms of generational renewal, that's an important one, because for a long time we thought that because they were linked with the old anti-abortion organizations, their leadership was dying. On their way out. I know myself that taking a look at the French anti-abortion organizations, they had been around for decades, and their leadership was in their 70s and 80s, and I thought, well, we just need to be patient, they'll go away, and that's fine. But no, that's not the case. They found a way of generating new leaders so that they organize academies, training sessions, and in a number of cases they have even set up permanent institutions where they train new elites, giving them masters in marriage and the family and things like this, and who will then be able to work and influence laws and policies once they get into doing advocacy. And what we see also is with this generational renewal is a link with far-right, alt-right political parties. So that, I mean, some examples of this are in Poland or in France, where these institutions have been set up with the Rassemblement National. Here's just an overview of the professionalization and transnationalization. So in terms of professionalization, one key aspect here are some of the American groups that have come over to Europe. So a number of them are relatively new, such as Alliance Defending Freedom. If you take a look at the map of Europe, they're not in the beautiful cities of Europe there. They're not in Prague, they're not in Berlin or Paris or Madrid, but they are in Brussels, Strasbourg, Geneva, and Vienna. These are all the seats of human rights institutions or European institutions. So we can see their objective is clearly a political objective. And so some of these examples are Alliance Defending Freedom and the European Center for Law and Justice, which specialize in litigation before the courts. They bring the US experience of taking issues before the US Supreme Court. They bring that experience to Europe in trying to take cases before the European Court of Human Rights. And then transnationalization, I've already talked about that. Here's here's a picture of Agenda Europe. I like this just because it is a secretive network, and I like to show it just to show that it really did, these meetings really did happen. This is a picture of the Agenda Europe meeting that took place in 2016. What I think is interesting also is that one of the main conveners of that was an Austrian member of parliament from the Conservative Party, and there you can see the logos of the different organizations involved in organizing this. So you see American organizations, European organizations, and entities linked very closely with the Holy See, with the Vatican. So if we take a look more closely inside Agenda Europe, because I understand most of you may have read the report, Restoring the Natural Order, if we take a look at who's inside Agenda Europe, which has been behind over 15 different policy initiatives against human rights in Europe, we can find 5 categories of people. So first of all, the ones who convene the meeting together are what I would call Vatican Surrogates. So these are people very close to the Vatican, to the Catholic Church, but they're lay people. But they have very intimate contacts with cardinals, with bishops, etc. And it's their role to sort of advance the objectives and the social policies of the Church in a way so that it can fit within a political setting, so that the cardinals, the clergy, don't necessarily understand politics, but these Vatican surrogates will know how to do this. One example is the legal advisor to the Holy See, to the United Nations in New York. So we have the Holy See legal advisor, their man in the United Nations, being one of the co-conveners of Agenda Europe. And then you have 4 different categories there. They want to influence laws and policies, so you need insiders inside the institutions. So there we see one category of government officials, members of parliament, and EU officials also participating in this. Transnational luminaries. These are individuals and organizations which are not rooted in any one country. They work at a global or international level, and they're the ones that come up with the big strategies. How do we go against, or how do we roll back abortion rights? How do we stop the menace of equal marriage for LGBT people? So they're the ones that come up with the big strategies. And then from those big strategies, you have the national level implementers. These are people in different countries, in Czechia, Croatia, France, Sweden, etc. They're able to read the temperature and then to know what issues to run with at the right time, taking into account what's possible to do. So right now in Czechia, you've just had elections a couple of months ago. It's the right time to do this or that. Or in France, with Macron just being elected, this will be our strategy. So this is what the national level implementers do. And then finally, we have another category which we didn't understand what they were doing there, but we kept seeing their names appearing rather regularly, and then we realized that these are all wealthy people. So we deduced from that these are probably the likely financial backers, not necessarily of Agenda Europe, but at least of the movement or the issues in general. And so you have like European billionaires, Russian oligarchs, Yakunin and Malafyev, and then the US Christian right. So core ideas and strategies, we'll go a bit into that. So in terms of core ideas, the best example of this is a manifesto we were able to find from them entitled Restoring the Natural Order. So that's the original Restoring the Natural Order, and then we wrote our report using the same title. But it was quite fitting, we thought. So from Restoring the Natural Order, it's a 134-page document in English. We can see what their thinking is. Now, first of all, they themselves say that their ideas are not based on religious beliefs, but on natural law. So what they're saying is simply normal, the natural thing. But then if you scratch beneath the surface, natural law is itself a very Catholic concept to describe their own thinking. And then here, behind natural law, and they define it as being meant to uphold three key themes: life, from the moment of conception until natural death; family, the traditional heterosexual patriarchal family; and then freedom, the freedom to not be bound, essentially the freedom to not be bound by secular laws if you feel that your religious beliefs are hindered by these secular laws. If we then take a look at strategies, okay, because this document outlines a certain number of strategies which are quite useful, and they become obvious once they've outlined them themselves. So they themselves say that they should not be afraid to be unrealistic or extremist, realizing that some of the things that they want to do can't work in certain countries in a certain moment, but that doesn't mean they should stop from trying for them. Some of the specific strategies that they outline are positioning themselves as the new real victims. So they are the victims of intolerance by making LGBT people more accepted in society. It hurts their religious feelings to do this. Another thing that they talk about is frame their issues in terms of rights. So one of the ways that they do this is to want to argue for what they call conscience clauses, that they should have a legal right to not follow certain legislation in certain areas. Another strategy is to damage their opponents, so to call into question the legitimacy of women's rights groups, LGBT organizations, or those working in sexual reproductive health. And then once you call into question that legitimacy, work to defund them. And there's examples of attempting to defund the main organizations, the main NGOs, working in all of these different areas. Perhaps the most notorious are different attempts to defund those working to provide abortion care in the United States. That becomes a hot issue whenever the Republicans come into power. And then another issue is to try to become a respected interlocutor at international level. So over the past few years, we've seen attempts by these groups to try to gain access to the EU, the UN, etc., Council of Europe, by requesting ECOSOC status, participatory status, etc. If we take a look at what they want to do, this is also outlined in their own document. I won't go through all of this, but it's simply illustrative. They have examples by subject area, so marriage, contraception, equality, things they want to prohibit, things they want to adopt, and then other different things that they want to do. So just at marriage, so let's try to repeal all laws against divorce. They started doing this, but then a sex scandal happened in Poland by the main organization, which made them not able to go ahead with that. But that's a separate story that we can talk about. Things to adopt are the anti-sodomy laws. Anti-sodomy laws, those, we can see some progress being made in this respect in the Russian Federation, all the laws against gay propaganda, etc. And then also, as I said, to defund the different organizations involved in promoting these human rights. And you have examples in other areas, so prohibit pharmaceutical contraceptives, ban abortion. The strategy on abortion we know is to try to restrict and prohibit abortion, and then to stop the government funding of this issue. But there's more in the report there. Here's an example of one of the specific things that they've done on the Istanbul Convention, which again is on violence against women. So you can see there, the one on the left is from Alliance Defending Freedom. The other one is from this Polish organization, Ordo Juris, come out with very detailed, very serious-looking legal commentaries on why the Istanbul Convention on Violence Against Women is a bad thing for society. And you can see that these documents then go to politicians, judges, the courts, etc., and then make it into the system. Now we'll take a look at a bit at funding behind this movement. So we did a study last year where after we had presented about anti-gender organizations in a few reports, we got the question quite regularly, well, you know, where's the funding for all of this coming from? So we looked into this, and so what we did is identified 120 organizations active in different European countries, and we simply tracked down the finances for these organizations. We were able to find the finances, so annual accounts, annual reports, audited statements, etc., from themselves or public authorities. We found this for 54 organizations. So these are NGOs, foundations, religious organizations, and political parties. And what we found is that over a 10-year period, so over between 2009 and 2018, we can account for at least $700 million going into these anti-gender organizations. So this is only 54 of the 120, so 700 million is a conservative amount. Then when we take a look further, you can see the graph there. The 700 million, if we compare 2009 to 2018, we can see that there's a fourfold increase in funding for this anti-gender movement over the past decade. It's probably even more now that we're in 2022. But if you have 4 times more money over a decade, you can do more things. So I think the money explains in part why it is that these groups are being so much more noticeable across different European countries. And then when we scratch further, we can see that the money comes from 3 specific geographic sources. One is the United States. Now that's not a surprise. We always suspected there was a connection with the US pro-life Christian right organizations. We can, from the US, we can really account for over $80 million coming to Europe on anti-gender activism. These are mainly the legal organizations I mentioned. A new entrant into this anti-gender activism are actors from the Russian Federation, and specifically 2 of them. The different entities that have been created around 2 oligarchs who are very close or were close at one point to President Putin, and that is Vladimir Yakunin and Konstantin Malafeyev. And they have set up a range of different entities, so like media organizations, think tanks, organizations, etc., which gradually socialize different people from mainly Western countries, politicians, business people, etc., onto pro-Russian ideals. And we can see that this contributes to about $188 million to the anti-gender activism in Europe. And then finally, the biggest source is itself Europe, with over 400 million. If we take a look then, where does the 400 million from Europe come from? Beneath the iceberg, how do they generate money? We can see that there's many different ways, which are the ways that NGOs generate money. So small grassroots donations, astroturfing, political activism. They get money from rich people, from businesses, etc. But there's more of that in the report. Then take a look at results, and I'm almost finished here. I think I'm over my time, but if we take a look at results, what we can see overall, so taking a look at all of Europe now, okay, is that there have been significant setbacks in terms of human rights in some countries. Poland is a very good example of this significant setback. But what we've seen has, more generally speaking, across a greater number of countries, and from what I understand in Czechia itself, is that there's been a stop to what could have been anticipated changes. So that in a number of countries, we were expecting certain changes to happen. Most obvious case is Bulgaria, which was meant to ratify the Istanbul Convention. That got stopped. And so we see the same type of phenomenon happening in a range of different countries. If we then take a look at the European institutions specifically, there we can see that we have been able to largely negate their impact. And that's because they had invested quite a bit of activism into the European Union, or I should say international institutions, European Parliament, Council of Europe, European Commission, etc. They were able to do quite well up until 2013, 2014, and where they stopped some reports in the European Parliament. They were active at the Council of Europe. But because of their success, there was more awareness about them, and then there was a chance to reorganize against them, so that by now, we can say that they have very little impact. And then since the publication of our report there, where we basically outed a certain number of these organizations, we can see that a number of them have simply left Brussels. They've shut down their offices, and they're no longer present there. But what's happened instead is that they've retrenched to national level, so that they may not be in Brussels anymore or trying to influence the EU institutions or the Council of Europe, but they're there in Warsaw, in Budapest, and I would say London and Madrid as well. And then from there, they're using these new national bastions as launch pads to then try to influence once more the institutions, so that the leaders, the founders of one of these organizations, Ordo Juris, was nominated by the Polish government to be a judge at the European Court of Human Rights in 2021. He did not last 1 week in the nomination process, but just to show how high up he is connected within Polish power structures. And we can see that also, and at national level, we can see that these groups then are part and parcel of the process of de-democratization that we're seeing in some member states, such as Poland or Hungary, and to a certain extent other member states as well. So this is, so maybe just to sum up, with this anti-gender activism, we can see that it has migrated in time from being different types of projects. What had originally been a religious project thought of by religious thinkers and then taken up by the church, mainly the church hierarchy, and then other churches, has then migrated to other segments of society. The first other segments of society to take it up were civil society. From civil society, we then see that political parties have taken this up. At first, it was the center-right Christian democracy parties, that, for example, the Christian Democratic Union of Angela Merkel, very mainstream, etc. Being positioned within that type of Christian democracy, they were able to stop advances, but they were not able to initiate new things. And we see now a move by the anti-gender organizations towards the far right or the alt-right, which are more bold in their policy aspirations, and we can see that they're more easily situated there. And then from politics, we see that now, in some cases, anti-gender activism has become state policy, where these actors have been able to reach positions of high political power. Poland, Hungary are some examples, but the United States under Republicans are another example. Brazil under Bolsonaro, to a certain extent Russia and Putin. So we can see this metamorphosis taking place. So when we take a look at anti-gender activism, we have to understand that it is simultaneously a religious, normative, political, and diplomatic project altogether. It just depends who's doing what at which point. So maybe just some concluding thoughts. Anti-gender, I would say now it's a permanent feature of the European political agenda, of the landscape. While it is strong, I would say it's not as strong as they would appear, and that it does have specific weaknesses. As I've mentioned, we were able to safeguard, at least for now, a number of the EU institutions. Or European institutions. We need to find solutions for what to do about Warsaw and Budapest, but we can think about that. Another thing is that this movement has revitalized the progressive camp. So it's made us realize that certain advances that we thought were inevitable, we just need to be patient. Equal marriage will come to Czechia at some point. It's made us realize that, well, no, it's not a question of patience. We need to actually fight for this, and we need to better safeguard the rights that we think we have. One example of this is President Macron in front of the European Parliament during the French presidency, so just a few months ago, suggesting that abortion should be made a right in the EU rights on fundamental rights. So that's a new thing that has appeared, which would be worth considering. And then finally, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's been very embarrassing for a number of these anti-gender actors. A number of them have one of two types of connections with Russia. Either they're getting funding from Russia, or they're ideologically aligned with the conservative authoritarianism coming from Moscow. Whether you're getting funding or whether you really think like Putin, I don't know which one is worse or better, but both of them are happening. And we see that what's been happening now is that a very furious attempt to scrub from internet all traces of connections with Russia. And so it's interesting to see. So finally, anti-gender, they're most impactful when they're able to strike an ambush. So this is why it's important for us to be aware of who they are, how they work. And also, anti-gender, they fear the light of day. So that whenever we put attention on them, so that the reports that we've written, they really, really hate that. And so it's important also to understand this. And the more we take a look at who they are, how they work, the more we find out that they're not the nice, cuddly Christians that they pretend to be. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Please, thank you for these insights. Please hold on to your questions and comments. We'll now listen to Eva, and we will take all the questions afterwards.
Well, thank you, Niels, for this great presentation. It was quite comprehensive. It will be hard to say something interesting or new after this presentation. But the nature of my work is a little bit more towards the ethnographic and socio-cultural approach, so I hope I will add some insight, and also I will talk mostly about the Czech case. So let me take you on a journey through my PhD research. In 2017, I got accepted for my PhD project in Aarhus at Aarhus University, and I was supposed to study women's involvement in far-right organization in Czechia. And so when I started doing my research, I looked into their websites, and I was constantly coming across this notion, gender ideology. Back then, I thought it was something quite weird because I did not know what that was about. And then I got into Niels' work, and I found out there was this anti-gender movement which was slowly coming to Czechia, and decided that that's something we need to need more about. And I changed the topic of my dissertation and started writing about how this anti-gender discourse traveled into Czech public space, and also how it got settled there, and how it resonated with the local context. Do I sound okay with the microphone? I'm not used to talking. Okay, good. So what did I do? The first thing I had to do was to find out who were the anti-gender actors in Czechia. To do so, I went into the Czech media database, and I looked for this weird, for me at least, weird notion, gender ideology, and I found some traces up to the year 2010, and then I followed the genealogy, and I was interested who were the people who used the notion gender ideology, also how they talked about gender ideology, and how the meaning of the gender ideology was slowly spreading and changing and traveling. So let me start by showing you, this is the outcome of my PhD. I was a bit creative and created this timeline. So I divided the last decade into 3 periods when I talked about the early adopters, the ones who started using this innovation, which came, as Neil just told us, from outside of Czech Republic. It was we can track this discourse back to 70s when new Christian rights started emerging in the US, and then through their transnational networking, also with Russia and also with Vatican, they created this powerful discourse about gender ideology. It started emerging in the mid-90s. So the early adopters who started using this innovation started writing about gender ideology around 2010. They were very few, and they didn't succeed in making it a mainstream notion. Then I move little bit 4 years later, around the Euromaidan crisis, we have much more adopters. There we can see the pro-Russian variation of the anti-gender discourse traveling to the Czech public space. I will get back to it later. And then finally, 2018, unfortunately, we have this period which I call momentum. That's when the anti-gender activists and anti-gender discourse starts emerging in mainstream politics, and they start having success. For instance, stopping the ratification of Istanbul Convention, which hasn't been ratified until today, even though our former Prime Minister, Andrej Babiš, as you probably know, promised to have the convention ratified by the end of the year 2018. So let's get back to 2010, and who were the early adopters? So back then, the very first people who started writing about gender ideology were people from this right-wing neoliberal think tank called Civic Institute, in Czech, Občanský institut. These people were people who grew from the pre-revolution Catholic descent, and they had this very strong anti-communist sentiment. They believed that to prevent the communist dictatorship from happening again, we need to establish 100% pro-market economy. That was the basic idea. And so they were obviously very much influenced by the Christian conservatism. Some of them actually went to study in the US and came back promoting these pro-market ideas. On their website, they claim that one of their main inspiration sources are Milton Friedman or Friedrich Hayek. So that would be one group. There was another group which was personally and ideologically quite linked to this group. It was this group which we know nowadays under the name Alliance for Family. Well, back then they were not called Alliance for Family, back then they were called Výbor na ochranu práv rodičů, the Committee for the Parental Rights, and they were opposing sex education, which is one of the topics which is very often the part of the culture wars. In 2016, as Neil just told us, there was the professionalization and transnational networking, and they changed their name to Alliance for Family, and they changed their logo to be connected with other movements outside Czech Republic, such as Lamaniv Putus and all the other groups. So this parental movement was opposing sex education, and they had a lot of different arguments. One of them was that sex education was indoctrinating our children with this dangerous gender ideology, which will basically teach children not to be boys and girls, but to be gender neutral individuals. What is important here is the element of children, because if you want to create a powerful moral panic, you need an especially fragile victim. So once you talk about children that need to be protected, the children are in danger, then you can mobilize people. That's what they tried. However, this debate was quite heated, but the gender ideology didn't become the mainstream notion. It was only very fringy. They talked about other things, but gender ideology didn't become the main argument. It was mainstreamed quite later. And then, so to sum it up, these people were all related. I forgot to say that the current chairperson of the Alliance for Family is a wife of the current chairperson of the Civic Institute. So they were ideologically also personally linked, and they were mostly opposing back then. They were not talking about a lot of things. They were opposing mostly gender studies and all these post-structuralist theories challenging ideas of gender ideology. And they claimed gender studies were non-scientific, extremist, against biology, and neo-Marxist. So there was this anti-communist sentiment, so they used this Marxist label. And they used mostly an economic argument. They would be saying gender studies are sucking the money from the state, and they are just growing another generation of genderists who will not find a job at the labor market, so they will have to end up working in gender NGOs. So that was this economic argument. There was, however, already Czech version of the pro-Russian variation of the anti-gender discourse growing. However, it was not happening exactly in the Czech Republic. It was happening in Ukraine. And so who I am talking about now, this is a group, it's a, let's say, a religious movement, which is also very often labeled as a sect. They are called Byzantine Catholic Patriarchate, and those are former Catholic priests from Czechia who decided at one point in their career that the Catholic Church was going down the hill. It wasn't not Catholic. It stopped being Catholic enough, so they themselves promoted to the roles of bishops. Well, Vatican didn't like it, so Vatican responded by excommunicating them from the Catholic Church, and so they moved to Ukraine, particularly to Lviv, and started a new movement. They excommunicated from their website the Pope, and they claimed Patriarch Eliáš became the new Pope. So this group, according to some sources, had about 200,000 followers, and even though they pretended to be a religious movement, they were mostly a political group. If you look up their website, they are very active. They write in 9 languages, and it doesn't take you a long time to find out that they are very much a pro-Russian propaganda, trying to prevent, back then it was the year 2013 I'm talking about, they were trying to prevent Ukrainians from wanting to join the EU. So they would base the anti-gender discourse around the narrative about morally pure Russia and degenerated West. And the topics they would be talking about would be sex education, juvenile justice, also Istanbul Convention, vaccination, about which they talked only as about chipization of populations. That was before COVID, so it's a long history of anti-vax and also LGBTIQA themes. And all these topics would be summed up under the themes such as dirty business with children. Children in the EU are taken away from their parents and they are used as organ donors, or this is an organized genocide on nations. And so I wanted to give you a taste of this discourse so you know how it looks like, and I chose to show you one quote, and just to make it clear, I wasn't very selective. I just chose something randomly because their material is really rich, so you don't have to try really hard to find something bizarre. Okay, this is, I also did the content analysis, and so again, children are the most frequently used word, so this is a proof that they were trying to build their narrative again around moral panic. Their most used strategy was moral panic about Ukrainian children. Ukrainian children were in danger. Now I will show you how they were in danger. The ideology of the EU is ruining the healthy roots of European civilization and all moral values, particularly through the so-called Lisbon Treaty, which is prioritizing pervert homosexuality and also introduces the juvenile justice and sexual anti-education of children. It legalizes narcotics and euthanasia that will serve as a mass destruction of impotent people. All guillotines and gas chambers are not effective and repel people, in contrast with unnoticeable sweet death. Euthanasia. You send the children and youth of Europe to spiritual and physical death. So this is basically how their discourse looks like. And I know it looks scary, but it's quite frequent, and this is nothing special. They have much worse preaching, which I found out on their website. And this kind of pro-Russian variation of the anti-gender discourse starts traveling to Czechia in 2014 onwards, and it does through conspiratory websites. So those are the new websites start emerging in Czechia. Since through my research, I was looking for the gender ideology. Those were the outlets which covered gender ideology the most. So those are the usual suspects. There are personal blogs on iDnes, and then all the conspiratory websites as we know them, Parlamentní listy, Europortal, Protiproud, Infokurir, etc. The experts who were studying conspiracies in Czech public space, they found above 42. Now with the war, with the Russian aggression towards Ukraine, some of these websites were banned. And so the main idea of the conspiracy websites were that the European Union was stealing children. Particularly, these people were able to find cases of parents who lived abroad. They were Eastern Europeans, Czechs, Slovaks, also Russians, and they actually lost their children because social services took them for alleged abandonment. And these cases were medialized, and we had one in Czechia, I guess you all remember it, and it became a question of nationality. Even our president then, Miloš Zeman, got involved, and the narrative was awful. Norway is taking children from Czech people. The thing is, it wasn't an original story because there was a Russian version in 2013. Irina Berset, she was living in Finland. She also lost her 2 children. She moved back to Russia and started this movement called Russian Mothers. It was pro-Putin movement, and they were organizing rallies, and she was also claiming that her children were taken away in Finland, and the social workers put masks of Putin on their face while they were sexually abusing them. So conspiracy theories like that were part of the movement. And so why I'm talking about Russian mothers, do I still have time? You probably know about the movement Angry Mothers, which was the women's version of the anti-Islam movement in Czechia, which was quite successful because they were able to gather to amass 35,000 followers on Facebook. It was quite anti-immigrant page, and they were directly inspired by this Russian movement. So there is clearly ideological, maybe perhaps financial link to Russia as well. And so 2015, when the refugee crisis came, this anti-gender discourse got a new twist, and it started playing. It was also featured mostly on this conspiratory website I just talked about, and it started playing with the idea of gender ideology was part of this great replacement, also known as white genocide. So the idea was these European elites were making European nations homosexual, dying out, and instead inviting all these immigrants from the Middle East and north of Africa. So I have chosen some random headlines which I came across through my research. So, for instance, Islamic fundamentalism and gender ideology are the twin evils of modern times, or Sharia, gender, and homosexuality, the paradoxes of the degraded West. And around this time, 2015, Russia becomes clearly the central element of the anti-gender discourse. And Alexei Komov, who is prominent figure of Russia, Russian anti-gender movement, comes to Czech Republic, and he's talking at an event organized by far-right organization Akce Dost, Action Enough, and he's talking there together with the current leader of the pro-life movement, Hnutí pro život. So that was the clear link to Russia, and also at that time, gender ideology is used for the first time in the mainstream politics. The members of Christian Democrats starts opposing the ratification of Istanbul Convention, claiming that we already have legislation tackling domestic violence, and this is a Trojan horse bringing gender atrocities to Czechia. And then we are coming closely to the momentum and to the end of my presentation, slowly. Catholic Church gets involved, and since we always talk about, we usually think that anti-gender discourse is religiously motivated. In Czechia, Catholic Church got involved as the last branch. And in 2017, the Czech Archbishop had a speech on the occasion of St. Wenceslav's Day, in which he asked the Muslim refugees to be strong enough and go back to their countries and fight for their countries during the war, as well as he warned against the gender ideology, and he talked about the oppressed majority, which is, as we know, the rhetorical device very often used by far-right actors trying to twist the narrative about discrimination. And so exactly 1 year later, 2018, the same holiday, St. Wenceslaw holiday, another Catholic priest has another speech. You probably, the Czech people sitting here probably remember this speech. Father Pidha, who is also our former Minister of Education, claimed that homosexuals will be the ruling class and parents will lose their children because they call them a girl or a boy and they will be sent to concentration camps and we all will be less than insect because for insect, such gender laws do not apply. Well, that created a lot of media, that attracted a lot of media attention. It was medialized, and my argument is that this speech was crucial for making the anti-gender discourse visible in Czech public space. Czech women's lobby sued Father Pidha for scaremongering, which gave kind of a discursive weapon to the alt-right because they started saying, look, it's gender dictatorship. It's the same as it was before the revolution. They want to imprison priests for saying the truth out loud. Yeah, so I wanted to show in this presentation that there are three distinguished branches, and for each, which were united under this powerful discourse of traditional family, protecting traditional family, but each of the group has different kind of argumentation, and they also have very different political and communication style, due to which they're able to reach wider audiences, because each group talks to different people and provide them with different arguments and different subject positions with which they can identify. And part of my research was talking to these activists who got involved in the anti-gender activism. And when it comes to the neoliberal branch, as I said, the argumentation was strongly economic. They tried to polish away all the religious influence. They talk only about genderists as the parasites of society. And in that case, like they try to look very sophisticated and as serious political actors, and they don't promote themselves as homophobes, but they use very scientific argumentation. So in their case, the ideal target group would be like profit-oriented middle class or graduates from universities with practical education, such as University of Economics or Engineering, which I can tell you a story. It works, because when I came to my hometown after I was accepted for my PhD and said, I got a PhD in Denmark, my childhood friends who are the graduates from economics were really excited, but then they asked about what? And I said the gender aspects of far-right mobilization, and they said, no, that's not a science, that's an ideology. So some people actually buy into it. It's quite successful. Then there is this religious branch, which are the Catholics, and Dorit Geva, a French sociologist, she studied the French movement Manif pour tous, and she claimed that most of the activists involved in this movement are bourgeois Catholics, highly educated middle class, who feel in competition because they achieved quite high status in society, but because through secular universities, but because of their religious beliefs, their belief is in contrast with what they are taught at the universities. So for them, this is kind of epistemological struggle. They try to make the religious understanding of the world valid, equally as valid as the ones which is promoted in the secular universities. And then the last one, the pro-Russian far-right branch, I found those the most interesting because the people I talked to were openly people who were very much disappointed with the transition from state socialism to state capitalism, and they felt left behind. They basically translated their class struggle into the discourse of gender ideology. And to prove my point, I will finish my presentation by reading a quote from one of my interviews. Look, I have to admit, I did not want the revolution. In March 1989, I became a store manager. I was doing so well, and then the revolution came. I was like, stop bringing the keys, go home. What are you missing? We have cheap bread. How great is that? Do you want to have the same prices as they have in the West? I tell you, it was all the students from Prague. Nobody cared about what we wanted. None of us here wanted it. They were chanting, Havel to the castle, and I didn't even know who Havel was. I just have a feeling that everything we had before the revolution is 10 times worse now. And thank you for your attention. That's it from me.
Thanks for the two perspectives that complete each other. We've heard about the transnational movement, and now we've heard about the Czech Republic. I would like to start asking two questions, and then I'll give the floor to you. So if I may first ask Neil, you said that the anti-gender movement didn't achieve much success on the level in the EU institutions. Would you, but there were several policy initiatives up until 2013. Then you said there was more information and knowledge about what these policy initiatives were. Up until then, were there some successes, and did the presence of the new or unexpected resistance to other human rights initiatives actually bring about any change in framing or in a discourse concerning the issues that the anti-gender movement is concerned with, like abortion or women's rights? So were there some discursive changes? So this would be a question for Neil, and I would like to ask Eva if she can also see something like this happening. Do you feel that the gender ideology that you have described actually is something that unites very different groups and people with very different motivations? Do you feel that it has changed the way we speak about human rights in the Czech Republic or women's rights in the Czech Republic? And could you give a few thoughts about this? Thank you. So, similar question to both of you.
Thank you. So, in terms of the at the level of the European institutions, we saw that up until 2013, they had been laying the groundwork, and that's when they really came onto the scene. And there's a few things that really come together in 2013. First, 2013 is the first year that Agenda Europe meets. So they have their first meeting in London in early 2013. 2013 is also the year that Citizen Go, this online social platform, is launched. And we first become aware of Citizen Go in the discussions in the European Parliament around what's called the Estrela report. It was a report on sexual and reproductive health and rights. And then out of nowhere comes Citizen Go. And then they start spamming members of the European Parliament so that some of them receive 30,000 emails in one day. So just imagine, you're a normal member of parliament, and then you're working on a report. You know it's a bit dicey because it talks about sex and all of this, but then all of a sudden you get 30,000 emails in one day. So you start thinking there's something happening here. And we didn't, the progressive side didn't have the chance to explain what Citizen Go was at that time. And then also the timing of 2013 was just before 2014, which were the EU elections. And so the discussions of the Estrella report on sexual and reproductive health and rights took place at a time when loyalty to the political party was at a premium. Because if you deviate from loyalty to the political party, you may not end up being on the electoral lists for the May elections in a couple of months. And so that's when we lost a certain number of support from individuals we know would have been supportive. So we lost that report as a result of the campaign of the anti-gender, and that took place at the end of 2013. That was the first time that the Progressive had lost a significant report. So that's when we saw that they came together. And then 2013 and then 2014 is when it became apparent that they had organized and collected signatures for a European Citizens Initiative called One of Us. This One of Us Citizens Initiative they asked for the EU to stop providing any funding to anything involving the destruction of the human embryo. And they had defined this as stem cell research and then development aid focusing on maternal health, because by providing poor countries with maternal health funding, it may involve providing abortion. And so that's what they were aiming for. They got 1.7 million signatures. There was a hearing in the European Parliament in April of that year. And so all of this came together in just those few months. The reaction from the European Parliament on progressive civil society was quite important. So that members of the European Parliament created an informal alliance called All of Us in reaction to One of Us, which regroups MEPs from the four progressive parties, so the far left, the Greens, the SND group, and the Liberals/Renew group. And from there, they've been organizing events. So now there's a high level of awareness about this. And so that was 2013, and then 2013, 2014, and then since then, they were able to organize to stop being influenced by Citizen Go and other spamming platforms, so that now there's filters on the emails, and they know that when they get thousands of emails like this from different places, they know not to listen to that. So they've been able to build up resilience in this respect. And so that's how things happened up until then. These were their successes. Then 2018 came. There was a documentary on French public television on Arte, which revealed Agenda Europe for the first time, and then our report, Restoring the Natural Order. So then they were sort of outed, and Alliance Defending Freedom and others could not go around the European Parliament as easily as they could, and so they simply left. And same thing happened at the level of the Council of Europe. Now, in terms of the discursive framings that they've been using, we can see, I haven't really analyzed it as such, but we can see whereas before they were really in favor of pro-life, human dignity, and that. But that only went to a certain extent. We can also see that in the early days, they simply adopted language and ideas from the United States and then tried to implement them at the level of the EU. So that, for example, they were calling on the EU to defund Planned Parenthood, which is a message straight from the US. And okay, it's the same English language, but it doesn't fit within an EU context because the EU does not fund Planned Parenthood. And so even if you're supportive of this, there's nothing you can do. But they would even introduce amendments into the budget about not funding Planned Parenthood. And we were in a situation, it was a bit like a silly kabuki theater. They were introducing these amendments and we were working with our MEPs to block them. But even if the amendments passed, they were not actionable. It was purely a symbolic battle between the two sides. And then at a later phase, what we see is more at the Council of Europe, where there's more room for innovation and creativity, them trying to use different approaches. So some of the ones that some of the approaches that they've used is that of religious freedom. So the religious freedom to not have to follow certain laws. Related to this also is the narrative of Christian persecution. So Christians are the most persecuted people in the world and are deserving of special protection. And then related to this also is that of demography and demographic winter. And you talked about it in your presentation as well. So demography, demographic winter, which then leads to the great replacement. So there's not enough white European Christians being born because of gender ideology. And then related to this, there's a deliberate attempt by these elites to import Muslim populations. So you can have racist versions of this and then less obviously racist versions of it. And they were trying to run with these ones. So these are the main three ones the main changes in framing that I can see them using.
Thank you. So the question was, did the way we talk about human rights in Czechia change? So I would lie if I would say I have exact data on how it goes, but I can also talk about how they try to reframe the human rights, and I don't know how they succeed. Maybe it would require some more research among society and how much people buy into this narrative. But so they changed the narrative about the human rights into, as Neil already talked about, into the rights of parents. They talk about the rights of majority, the rights to oppose feminism. They would call about the right for women to stay at home, to be mothers, to be feminine, which is taken away by the feminism from them, which is kind of also sometimes interpreted as the criticism of the neoliberal feminism. And however, some of the people I interviewed also, but some of the people who are involved in this anti-gender activism now have quite powerful positions. They work as assistants of powerful politicians, and I can already see some changes also on the political mainstream level when our Minister of Social Affairs and Equality suggests to change the name of his ministry to Ministry of Social Affairs, Equality and the Family. It sounds like an innocent move, but it is a symbolical politics selling signal what he wants to do with that ministry. And when Neil talked about the Christian persecution, I thought it was quite interesting because it came up a lot in my research, since Czechia has this totalitarian past where there was tangible discrimination of Christians. They use this narrative very often, and every single Christian activist I talked about the discrimination of Christians, and they capitalize on this unjust past and bring it to present. So that's very common aspect.
Thank you. So let's take questions or comments from the audience. We have a roving microphone. If you want to.
Yeah, hello. I have a question for Eva. If she was able to find out if the organizations and movement, how they cooperate with each other, because you mentioned who they were, what they did, but I don't know, did you manage to find out that they're meeting somewhere in the living rooms of each other, or, you know, somewhere in the hotels? Like, how does it work?
This is a great question. I forgot to talk about this in my presentation. So there were these three branches I talked about, and I divided them. And when I did the interviews with them, the first two branches, the neoliberal one and the Christians, the Catholic ones, they would be saying, the last ones, the right-wing extremists from this organization, Czech Traditional Family, which is tied to the far-right populist party SPD, we don't really like them. We don't want to be associated with them. They're fascist, they're too much, they mobilize emotions, they're not rational, we don't like the image. But during my research, I attended a lot of events when I saw all of them cooperating, talking in the same event, inviting each other. They also told me they are quite useful because they know how to mobilize people, but we don't want to be associated with them. So.
Hi, question for Eva. How much has the situation changed? since the election? Has it got better or has it got worse?
Well, since the election, a lot of people is involved in the politics, as I just talked about, and I feel they have more power, as well as the pro-life movement started, as you probably know, lately filling the newspapers because they made some outrageous statements about helping the raped women in Ukraine. So I hope that this could mobilize the people on the other side. Yeah, but I don't know. This is my hypothesis. I don't know.
I was actually going to ask about what you just mentioned briefly about Ukraine and about Neil mentioning that some of these organizations have been embarrassed by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So if you could foresee the development, perhaps how much the Russian invasion will shape the movement?
How much the Russian invasion will shape the movement? That's a good question, which I don't think I am able to answer it without a crystal ball, but I feel that a lot of people are trying to hide their connections to Russia, but some of them are actually not, and I hope this will be legitimized based on their support for the Russian aggression. But that would be for example, the Angry Mothers I talked about. Their chairperson is openly pro-Russian and promoting anti-Ukrainian sentiment. Yeah.
I can simply add to that as I mentioned, we know that some of them probably have received Russian funding. So that, for example, Citizen Go that I mentioned, up until maybe 2 weeks ago, Citizen Go, this social media platform based in Madrid, their executive committee, their governance board, had on their website, they mentioned Alexei Komov, the Russian man that you mentioned, which we know is very close to Konstantin Malafeyev, one of the Russian oligarchs. When this was revealed in an article, 5 days later, his name is gone from the Citizen Go website. And we see a similar process happening with a number of different organizations. And we have to remember, up until the Ukrainian invasion, the authoritarianism of Vladimir Putin was seen as something to aspire to for many far-right or Christian nationalists in many different countries in Europe. It was normal. I mean, just recently, Marine Le Pen in France, there's several pictures of her with Vladimir Putin, and this was meant to reinforce her image as someone who could take on presidential office. It's only the past couple of months now that has become very toxic. We see them now trying to clean up their images.
I have a question to both of you. Based on your research, what do you consider to be best strategies to challenge these movements? Because as far as I understood and as far as I know, they basically plagiarize their enemies. Yeah? They all, from Benoit to, I don't know, Orban, read Gramsci, and they tried to make some counter-hegemonic movement. They reclaimed, as you depicted, reclaimed terms like human rights. So my primary idea would be, okay, so what about reclaiming their terms? For example, as Eva spoke about renaming of the ministry, is a real problem that we will have ministry which will take care about family, or the problem is definition of family, which is heterosexist? And maybe we should, if they reclaimed our terms like human rights, we should reclaim their terms like family and to struggle about their content and say, okay, if we want to defend families, defend all kind of families. But I don't know, maybe it's slippery slope and maybe you see some better possibilities for anti-strategies.
Yeah, I think that there's a number of different possible strategies that can be explored, and the strategies really depend on who the person is who would be employing them. So strategies may be different if you're a member of parliament or a policymaker or in government, rather than an academic, or separately if you're from CSO or business. So the perspective of who will deploy the strategy is very context specific. But some of the thoughts that come to my mind about overall strategies that we should be exploring, because you're not the first person to ask such a question, and my thoughts are that one thing that we really need to do is what I would call discover and disrobe the anti-gender. So we research them, and the more we research them, we will show that they are not who they appear to be, and we can disrobe them to the public. And just recently, with their positions on Ukrainian women who have been raped, I think that's an example of that. A next thing that we can do is disarm them. Once we study them, we will soon find out that they have a very limited repertoire of tools and arguments that they can use. Once we understand this limited repertoire, we can prepare our media and our decision makers for what is likely to come. So, and we did this with, in the European Parliament. There was a report on sexual reproductive health and rights adopted in last year by a Croatian MEP. We knew there was going to be a lot of contestation. We explained to him, this is what will happen. Citizen Go will do this, Alliance Defending Freedom, European Centre on Law and Justice, all of these groups, this is exactly what they will do. We cannot prevent them from doing this. But when it does happen, they're not scary. There's a plan in place for how to deal with this. And so this is one way that we were able to disarm them. A third area is dislocating them. As I mentioned, these groups strive, they yearn for legitimacy and being recognized by different public institutions, by the EU, Council of Europe, UN, or national bodies. We need to ask ourselves whether it's legitimate that they have this type of recognition. Scholars are increasingly talking about a movement in a new development called about the emergence of uncivil society, so that they are NGOs, but they don't respect or are grounded in the same foundations of human rights or democracy that all other actors are in civil society. So therefore, do they need to be given the same access as others? Another aspect would be to demonetize. One of the things to take a look at is where do they get their funding? In many cases, they get funding from public authorities, so that in Slovakia, some of the groups get public funding in order to deceive women about accessing abortion. Now, is this the right use of public funding? In other countries, they get funding from big companies. So any of you who have been to Spain, you've probably been to this department store, El Corte Inglés. The founder is one of the big funders of the anti-gender movement in Spain. Shouldn't there be some accountability campaign there? It's private money, the guy can do what he wants with it, but maybe there are commercial consequences to be considered. And then finally, there would, aside from demonetize, I would say there's one of defense. One is that human rights defenders are very often attacked. The best case of that is what's happening in Poland now with everyone working in human rights, in sexual reproductive rights and abortion rights, is facing lawsuits. So one, better legal defense, but then another aspect of defense is taking a look at the things that we want to work for and making sure that they are well anchored in a legal framework. In many cases, abortion is not a human right or a women's rights, and according to legal to the laws of in each country, usually it is still a crime which is not prosecuted if the woman follows a certain procedure for accessing abortion. Now, is this really the legal order we want for certain things that we would consider human rights? Maybe it's time to update our human rights legal framework to correspond to what we actually want.
Thank you. I will have a little bit less elaborate answer. So the first answer to this is that it is a great question, because that's what we are working really hard in our project OLIPOL together with Zora. and we will probably find out the answer in 2 years, and there is the outcome of the project. And the other thing I wanted to talk about was that Polish authors were studying these anti-gender campaigns in Poland, Aniczka Graf and Elżbieta Korolczuk kind of offer similar answers you do. So if you look at cultural wars, there are these like two sides, 7% on each side of society who are decided they are either dead or dead, and then there is this gray area of people which they can be convinced. And I believe that the last people I talked about, the people I described as people using gender ideology discourse in order to express their class struggle, I believe that those were convinced by the powerful discourse they created because they were able to identify with the subject position offered by the discourse, even though it was invented by pro-market neoliberal intellectuals with whom they disagree. They want socialism, right? So what the answer could be a left-wing populism and changing our language, stop using academic terms like intersectionality and start talking to the people the way they understand and simplify our language and try to do it differently than we did until now. Yeah.
One more question.
I think I have a few comments and questions as well. So, are comments okay as well? Okay, great. So I very much liked your stress, Neil Datta, on the generational renewal of the movements, because I think that this is what we've been seeing also in Slovakia, and how the involvement of various generations also changes. So it became quite appealing to, for example, young lawyers or young professionals to really become these human rights defenders, and really the professionals who can take a position in the public policy sphere, in the state administration. So I think this is a huge change from what I can see in Slovakia. So before we had really like these great ideologues from the Christian Democratic Party. Now we have really like public policy professionals who studied at secular, not just religious, but really secular institutions, but got their training in ad hoc workshops organized by these transnational networks. So I think this is really important, because I think one of the presuppositions of a lot of people in feminist movement or in LGBT movement years ago was that, okay, this is a generation of politicians in their 70s or so whose party support is actually decreasing, and their generation will simply die out. This agenda will not be on the agenda anymore. But the stress on generational renewal and professionalization, I think it really explains a lot of what's been happening. I have a lot more comments, but I would like to pose a few questions, perhaps. When you talked about funding, like the numbers are huge. At the same time, I'm also wondering about this discourse that we're hearing now in the pro-life movement, the defense of the pro-life movement here in Czech Republic, that basically says that, well, there is no big money actually involved. All the money that we have comes from the individual donors. And so this might be this may be a trick, and there may be, and very probably is, larger funding. But at the same time, a lot of work done for these organizations is done on voluntary basis. So lots of people get involved just because they are church members. So I just would like to perhaps stress that the picture of one large organization that is there behind sort of leading the puppets, I don't know to what extent it is accurate, without saying that, okay, there are so many soldiers on the ground, so to say, who basically do everything, like from very conviction, right? So from very pure moralistic, righteous conviction. So I just wanted to stress this. And two questions. One to Eva concerns the coming of the Catholic Church to the scene. So what is your explanation of why did Catholic Church turn up on the scene at that particular point of time in 2007 and 2018? So that's something that I'm really very much interested into. And another question to Neil. We've seen recently, well, in Great Britain, we've seen the trans discourse gaining ground in the past 10 years. And I'm just wondering, like, where this anti-trans discourse actually fits into this, into the whole image that you've just depicted, because I think that there are these really interesting alliances potentially being formed and actually discursively, if not personally being formed, between radical cultural feminists and these more traditional, now already traditional anti-gender actors. So I was just wondering, like, where you see this connection, like how these discourses, to what extent, like these discourses can interconnect, how, where they can actually clash, and potentially we can see their contradictoriness. So yeah, I'm really interested in your view on this.
Yeah, I guess I'll start. On the anti-trans thing, I haven't looked at it in detail, but just from what I've observed, we see several things. First is that anti-trans discourse has at least, perhaps more, but there's at least 2 points of origin. So that there's an anti-trans origin within feminism itself that goes back many, many decades. And then what we see is a more recent appropriation of trans issues by the classical anti-gender organizations. And it looks like it is the fusion of those two things which have led to the current situation in the United Kingdom and in a few other countries. And it looks like to me, it looks more like the anti-gender organizations are the ones who have really weaponized and developed the more modern talking points against trans rights, which have then been picked up by the older generation of feminists. And so, for example, this idea of trans people in the bathroom scaring, those are, these come from the anti-gender movement. What's a pity is that it looks like the feminists who are trans-skeptical have not realized the origin of these speaking points, and so they're taking on positions and forging alliances with organizations and individuals which are against women's rights in every other aspect. So it's painful to watch this. Separately, we see also that trans issues, they come up more specifically in countries where it looks like those countries are too progressive to make any inroads on LGBT or abortion rights. So that trans rights has made it really, or anti-trans thinking has made it really big in the United Kingdom. Spain, we see that it's coming up in France and in Nordic countries, even Sweden and Norway. Now, what do all of these countries have in common? You can't make headway against abortion or LGBT rights. The legal ground is there, but by looking at trans rights, that's a new issue. There's less societal awareness about trans issues, and then also by scoring a victory on trans rights, you can open up the Pandora's box for all of the other issues. So it's a very useful issue for them to look into, and so we see this happening.
And about the church, so there is a historical explanation, because the Czech church was quite unsuccessful. After the revolution, people expected that the church will come back to power, which happened in Poland, I guess in Slovakia. Especially the Polish Catholic Church was very good at, from the very beginning of the transition, working with the politicians and introducing religion in schools and making Poland Catholic again, while Czech Czech church didn't succeed as much. They were more focused on the restitution, getting back their buildings. And another explanation is that, which I actually know because I was doing an interview with one of the priests, the Czech priests went to Slovakia. They had a common conference in 2017, and then they came back and wrote their first pastoral letter. And they also invited some of the Slovak priests to come to Czechia. Marian Kufa, the populist Catholic priest, who is the face of the Slovak anti-gender movement, came to Czechia and held a speech. So there was clear connection and influence from Slovakia.
So, thank you for the questions. I guess we've made a tour. And it's time to thank our guests for their insight and answers. Thank you very much. It was, I think it was an interesting session, and I'd like to invite you to read more from Neil and Eva, and also from our OLIPOL project once there is some results. So thanks again for being here. Thanks for all the questions.